New stream. Today we are meeting Alex Corbitt from Boston. With very interesting, very interesting experiences in literacy and gaming and a lot. Okay, there you go, Alex. Send me the invite. Yes, perfect. This is great. All our guys there watching. This is good. Good. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hi, Alex. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, and you?
Good.
Oh my
It's a beautiful day here in Boston. It's like 82 degrees. I can show you outside.
Okay. Wow.
We got the
Wow, that's
fan
good.
going. It's warm.
We're starting the kind almost the winter here. It's kind of cool. I don't see the sun from my window, so I can't show you anything right now.
That's okay. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm glad. Lots of students are watching us. They are joining through questions. They have already sent questions, but they are digging into your profile and your work, and they are very excited about this talk.
Oh,
Very much.
I'm super excited. This is
Yeah,
such
I saw
a cool
you.
stuff that you've been doing. I've been keeping up with some of your interviews, and
Oh, great.
I love this is the first time I've done a live chat on Instagram. So that's a really exciting modality.
Yeah, I like it a lot. It's kind of easy to watch. It's people seem to like it because a lot of people join without being invited, and that's the point that we get kind of an audience that goes beyond our class. In fact, this is a class. This is the time we are supposed to be in class right now, and instead of a class, we talk to you.
I,
So the students are there. Say hi, please, all the guys who are in class right now. They should be saying hi in the comments.
oh, and the
And
cool.
yeah, there's a little delay. We talk and the hi comes later on, but they will probably say hi. It's a very small group. Okay. I don't know where to start. I have so many questions. There you go. All the hi's coming in now. I have so many interesting questions. These guys, the students present right now, they are very interested in how you inspire children to read more and the importance of doing that.
That's a great question. Um, I think part of learning, fostering a love for reading involves being able to see yourself in the text. So what that means is when you're creating a syllabus or a curriculum, curating texts that serve as mirrors and windows for students, right? To quote Louise Rosenblatt. So students need to see mirrors of their own identities in text and then windows into other experiences as well. But then also, I think in the writing classroom, providing youth with experiences to write themselves into texts through creative writing and fiction. So a lot of my thinking and my work over the past year and a half has really been around that and like fan fiction and stuff like that.
I love I totally adore the idea of mirrors and windows. Did you come up with that?
No,
Wow.
oh no, that was Luis Rosenblatt. uh
Oh, that's great. I'm gonna read that ASAP. And as regards, you said that, well, let's talk about the mirrors. Let's
yeah.
go to the mirror idea. I know you mentioned this in the private talk we had before, about identity in writing and reading.
Mhm.
Can you explore that idea of identity in texts?
Yeah, absolutely. So um maybe I'll start with kind of decentering myself and centering some scholars who have really kind of inspired my work. So from the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas and Dr. Amy Storniolo um, have in 2016 published an article in the Harvard Ed Review about restoring. And they call what they consider restoring is almost like remixing or rewriting a text, but in a way that recenters your identity. So, for example, I taught in New York City, in the Bronx, and my student population was primarily Black and Latinx students. So, if we're reading Harry Potter, which is predominantly white cisgendered characters in the UK, what would it be like to rewrite a chapter or write a short story that takes place in that world, but have Hogwarts exist in the Bronx, or have characters who represent the gender identities, racial identities, sexuality, ability of the students themselves. So recently, this book came out. It's called The Dark Fantastic by Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. And she talks a little bit more about this. And she's great because she's a woman of color, but she's also kind of unapologetically a nerd. And she loves fantasy and fan fiction and horror. And bringing kids' identities into the center of that work is so important. And I'm very interested in the horror genre because kids love spooky stories, but it becomes problematic when it's at the expense of women or of people of color, like the tropes, right? Like, women getting murdered, or the black person always dies first. These are common horror tropes that are very dangerous and problematic for young readers. So how can young readers rewrite these texts in a way that problematize the genre and forefront their identity?
And did you publish the productions? Are they available somewhere for us to read? This example.
So I'm in the process of writing an article about some work I did with youth around restoring, and in particular, one youth using a texting app, which I think it's called My Texting Story or textingstory.com. There's an app where you can actually create a narrative that looks like a text conversation. And she remixed a story by Neil Gaiman called The Price, which is kind of your typical run-of-the-mill horror story. It has all the trappings of kind of those classic conventions that are, very normative. And she rewrote this text in a way that problematizes some of the horror tropes and puts her identity at the center. And she takes the monster, which was like the devil, and she flips it and makes the monster loneliness. And so what does it mean for a monster to be your loneliness in a situation? How do you grapple with that? So seeing kids doing some really exciting and innovative work within genres that kids really like and they find interesting and fun. So.
And did you get the time to ask them what they think about the experience or get some feedback from especially the young ones?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting in the restoring framework that I was mentioning. There are a variety of different ways that youth and readers can bend or problematize a story. And that involves, let me see if I can find the framework here for you. I might not have it here. But that includes a variety of things, right? You can modify a story's setting or its place. You can modify the identity of a character. You can modify the time period in which a story takes place. You can write in collaboration with the community and so have multiple author voices. So what's interesting is which one of those forms of restoring resonates with different kids, right? So whereas some kids might want to take a story and center it in the location of the Bronx, New York City, other kids might be more interested in gender bending main characters and being like, well, what if this character or this hero were female or non-binary or transgender? So different kids are moved to bend stories in ways that reflect their very unique intersectional identities. So that was one thing I learned. Yeah.
That's great. Oh, that's so good. In some of your work, you talk about the benefits of technology. Can we talk about that?
Yeah,
And right now that we are immersed in technology, like non-negotiable.
yeah. That's a good point. See, technology is interesting because I think there are a lot of promises and a lot of precarities of technology. You know, I don't think that I can be a little skeptical when it comes to technology. I don't think it is a good unto itself. It depends on how it's used and the experiences that technology affords. So, for example, I've been paying close attention to a community uh, nearby that does live action role play, LARPing, which is almost like Dungeons and Dragons, like tabletop Dungeons and Dragons, uh, but except real world. So people dress up in costumes and they have swords and they fight and they have powers. Um, and recently, due to the public health crisis, they have moved into a hybrid space. And the reason why I don't say digital and I say hybrid is because it's not simply digital and it's not simply analog, it's some kind of mix of the two. So they've been still doing these adventures through Zoom, but the kids are still dressing up. At one point, instead of like shooting foam bows and arrows at each other, kids are like almost taking little pieces of paper and like trying to throw it at their like camera, and if it like blocks the camera then it was like a hit and everyone's like, whoa, you hit it. And so it's it's reductive to call that digital or only digital, because this is real world and analog to me, even though it might be digital to you. So I think those experiences are very hybrid. So I think not just like how can technology help, but where does technology and analog come together in learning in ways that are really exciting. And when I think about technology, I don't think about the technology itself. I think about what experience does the technology allow. So if the technology only recreates traditional school, like unfortunately, I think about Kahoot. Are you familiar with Kahoot?
Yeah, very.
And I don't think Kahoot changes the game. Kahoot,
And a good game.
a
It's just fun.
yeah, it's just fun, and it really takes multiple choice, A, B, C, or D, jazzes it up a little bit, makes it a little bit more visual, and then that's it. So I don't see that usage of technology as a transformative or transformational tool. Um, and that's not to say that it's everybody. If you use Kahoot, you're a terrible teacher. I've used Kahoot. I think Kahoot's very fun, but I just think it's important to think critically about what is this tool doing? Is it changing the game, or is it just kind of hiding traditional teaching in a slightly new form?
Interesting, very interesting. Can you mention the most interesting or your favorite hybrid game? Can you describe it for us?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I've been very excited about the what I more than more than like, for example, like a big game publisher that does this, and there are some. I won't promote any, like, in a public space, just because I try and keep the way I approach education in a very public kind of format rather than a private one. But going back to this LARPing community, I'm very interested in how communities do this together and how communities find these really interesting situations. I'm very interested in ways that people have been celebrating birthdays in hybrid ways, or graduations. I have seen people graduating from university who they have all of their families on like iPads or live streams, and there's music playing, but then they're dressed up in their robes. And I'm like, wow, this is a very, hybrid example of of a graduation ceremony. And that's very, very beautiful. So I think, I'm definitely sometimes inclined to look at what are like gaming developers putting out. And there are like boxed hybrid escape room products out there that are very exciting, and I've done some research with a couple of those. But I'm also very interested in ways that communities do this work, in ways that are outside of those more like corporate boundaries. Yeah.
And did you ever do escape room like can be adapted for beginners that study English as a second language and speak Spanish all the time?
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of gaming and just play more generally, or even doing online gaming and having your headset and talking, is I think a big part of language acquisition is speaking and listening, and I think that's a really good. I was going to say scaffold, but I don't even think that's a scaffold. I think speaking and listening can be just as rigorous and complex as reading and writing. So I think anything that allows for discourse in analog or online or hybrid spaces is super, super valuable. Yeah.
Definitely. You mentioned that the first skills we are supposed to teach when we approach foreign language teaching, like reading, writing, speaking, and listening. How does that come into games?
That's such a good question. I just quickly want to shout out one of my old students, Robinson's, commenting on here.
Yeah, I can see Rob. Yes, very active.
Man. So I'll give you an example. And the reason I try not to use the word literacy, and I try and use the word literacies, plural. And that shift has come as I've gone back to graduate school in my doctoral program, because people have multiple ways of knowing and being in the world. And one interesting thing, my advisor and my fellow colleagues on our research team have done some work around escape rooms. And we've actually had teams of undergraduates go into escape rooms with like GoPro cameras on their heads. And they do the escape room, and we're kind of seeing their experience from multiple angles. And it really makes me think, I haven't always been a great reader or writer, but over time, and through just years and years of schooling, I have improved over time. But if you put me in an escape room, I'm toast. I don't know what I'm doing, because there's so many other literacies or ways of reading the room, right? There's touch or haptic literacies. There's sonic literacies, understanding the sounds of the room. Even there were certain smells in the room. So there's a certain olfactory kind of way of knowing. So understanding the way that people make meaning in the world in ways that's not just as, I don't want to say two-dimensional, but maybe just as traditional as a typical, paper and pencil text, is really exciting to me. And it reminds me that there are so many ways of communicating and being in the world that might not even be reducible to verbal language, which is also makes me think that's an affordance for people acquiring new languages or being in spaces where they don't speak the primary language of the community, because that opens up the way I think about literacies and different ways of communicating. So escape rooms have been really helpful.
Okay, can you tell us about one you remember? Like, because some of us have never seen one, or I've never been in one physically. I just know them online. So
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did a series of 3 escape rooms, and we did them ourselves as the researchers, but then the participants did the same 3. And we were also thinking about how they learn and how they're how they get more experienced at these different forms of literacy over time. So the first one that we did was the magician's study. So it looked like an old library, and there was like a trick bookshelf that opened up into a space in the back where there was like a little temple behind, and it was really spooky and interesting, and all of the puzzles had kind of a magic theme to them. Then we also did an escape room that took place in an art gallery. It was called the Artist's Conundrum. And the idea was a famous piece of art had been stolen, and we went through the escape room to figure out how to track down the missing art. And then the last escape room that we did was a storybook themed escape room, and there were 3 rooms that were almost like different story worlds. So one book opened up, and it was a room that was like an underwater themed oceanic story. Another book opened up, and it was a room that was like a forest jungle theme. And then a third was like an underground lava cave theme. So you felt like you were going into different story worlds. And that's an entirely unique learning experience, and you take cues, and the puzzles matched the thematic elements of the room as well. So to be able to be successful at the puzzles required a deep reading of the room and the theme and all of those things. So just trying to do things outside of the realm of how we typically think about literacies in ways that kind of push our thinking a little bit.
Well, that's awesome. You mentioned pedagogical justice in your work. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I try to, I mean, I acknowledge my positionality as a white, cisgendered, heteronormative male. I grew up in suburban New Jersey. So while I recognize my positionality as a researcher and as a teacher, I do my best to center youth voices and intersectional, sometimes minoritized perspectives in my teaching, in my work, in my scholarship. I try to have that be a thread that runs throughout. So in the restoring work, where kids are rewriting speculative fiction, they're rewriting fantasy, horror, sci-fi, in ways that center their identities, I consider that to be a form of pedagogical justice. I think a lot of people say, we need diverse books, and they wait on publishers to provide that for students. And I think that's great. I think, I do think we need diverse books, and I do think intersectional perspectives should be in the literature that we teach and read. But I also don't want to deny youth the power of putting themselves into the stories that they read, and to create space, not to empower, because the power doesn't come from me, but to step aside and allow for space for youth to make their power known. So that's one example of pedagogical justice. When we do work about thinking of the affordances of different types of literacies and different ways of knowing, that decenters the traditional, text analysis or standard in the United States, we say standard American English, which is kind of a euphemism for kind of white, formalized academic, but that's even problematic calling it academic language, right? So just trying to expand our notions of how youth know and be in the world, so that we create space for various, epistemologies and ontologies and that kind of thing.
This is great. And you said that you have your own pedagogy and you engage your students as co-designers of projects.
Yeah, so one of the reasons, definitely in creative writing courses, so I'm teaching a course right now, and it's on teaching writing, and lesson planning, or planning for your pedagogy comes later. First, we write for ourselves, and we practice that teacher as writer mentality. And before we can teach writing, we need to be writers ourselves. And so the students in my course, the graduate students and they're all graduate students, have been doing a lot of just personal writing that is super meaningful to them. Writing comedy routines, screenplays, short films, journaling, restoring traditional fairy tales in new and exciting ways. So I think that very open participatory writing culture allows for us to think about writing in so many different ways. And when we think about what makes good writing instruction, everybody comes from a very unique perspective of the type of writing that sustains them. Simultaneously, when I think about the LARPing community, that live action role play sword fighting community, in Dungeons and Dragons and in LARPing, there's no one author of the story. Everybody in the community is co-authoring that story collaboratively. So the staff at this LARPing community, they might create the outline of an adventure to kind of get the creative juices flowing, but then the whole narrative and story and plot arc is 100% driven by the youth participants, because they're like, oh, I don't do that, I do this, and I act this way, and I decide to go here. And the story slowly unravels as everybody participates in that. So I'm interested in the way that shared authorship occurs in community in that way. And it's not just restoring a text that's out there, you're restoring yourself. Kids are becoming characters, and they're gender bending, and they're playing with their identity in so many different ways. This community attracts a lot of students who identify as non-binary because it's a safe space where they can play and do a lot of identity work in ways that are sustaining. So I'm absolutely interested in participatory, collaborative pedagogies and writing and composing and narrative and all of those things.
Oh, that's great. You also speak about teen activism in your work. And my students say that, what do you do with the information students gather? And is there any possible access for that? We need more inspiration.
Let me think. In my fourth year of teaching, I was lucky. Now, I know not every administration, in a school, principal and vice principals might allow for a space, an extracurricular space, but I did have, and activism shouldn't always be extracurricular. It should be at the center of the curriculum. But I did have the creative space to create a teen activism class that was an elective, and it was small. It had maybe about 15 students. But one thing we really practiced was collaboratively generating a curriculum together. So what that looked like is both the students and myself brought texts, videos, news articles to class, and we all participated in that curation process. And instead of traditional unit planning, where I have like a calendar and I start with, okay, this is our performance task or our project at the end of a unit, how do I work backwards and plan out how to get there? This was a little different and a little bit more collaborative in the sense that we created text menus, almost like when you go to a restaurant and you can pick from a variety of foods that you want to eat. We did that with texts. And when I say text, I mean short stories, videos, documentaries. And then from there, we organized them into themes or units, and then we picked which text we wanted to kind of chew on and read and think with and through as we went. So that's kind of how the curriculum planning worked. But then we also did a lot of projects that were very community centered. So we talked about bullying and harassment in school, and mental health. And so one thing that kids did was they created posters that they hung up around the school about strategies to maintain, you know, collegial spaces that promote mental health. We created an underground zine or magazine that was social justice oriented. So students wrote a variety of poetry and prose and quotes that they made. I actually have it. Hold on one second. That they made into a a double-sided activism zine, and then they shared it throughout the school community by putting it in people's lockers at the end of the day. So in the morning, people came to school and found them in their lockers. It was all anonymous, and the idea was almost like an anonymous, mysterious, edgy take on activism and sustaining discourse. So this was one of them that they created. And you'll see all the different, the student writing is there. And then we took this and photocopied it and shared it anonymously throughout the school. And then the kids created an anonymous email where other people could send in their work and submit it. To be fair, we never quite got to the point where other students were contributing and sharing out, but the idea, we ended up filming public service announcements after. They wanted to switch up the projects. But that was one idea, to have a repository where people in the community could submit work that was justice oriented.
Wow, that's so good. And you mentioned also safety protocols to deal with overwhelming situations. Is there an experience you can share about that? Because we do have overwhelming everything here in Argentina, especially in public schools. Sometimes discipline is a problem, or we don't know how to deal with all this stuff.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I wrote about that in an article in Voices from the Middle, which is an NCTE publication. Going back to recognizing my positionality as an educator and my identity, I recognize that there are limitations to the way that I can facilitate discourse among and between students. And I have many blind spots, and we might be discussing issues that could be triggering in ways that I don't always anticipate. And I try to anticipate it, but I try to stay keenly aware of my blind spots. So in order to be proactive, the students, this idea really came from the students, to create a sort of safety protocol where if this course took place right in the beginning of the year, in the September after our president, Donald Trump, was elected. And so students really wanted to kind of make sense of his election and think about that and understand the implications of that for their community and for our country. But at the same time, those questions and those discussions can be very triggering and emotional for everybody involved. And so we created a safety protocol where at any point a student could say pause on the discussion, no questions asked, and we could either go to a different part of the lesson. We would plan out what we wanted to do for each session on the whiteboard, and we would move to a different topic and then maybe revisit our discussion later if we felt more comfortable to do so. We also had a series of team building and group bonding games that we had in our back pocket. So, no questions asked, we could jump into kind of a more lighthearted game for 5 minutes where we're spending more time just connecting in a way that might not riff off of that previous conversation. So trying to think of ways, and I think that so much of teaching and learning is modeling. When I want to try, as I'm trying to become a researcher and write more research, I use other people's articles as mentor texts. And I think that in a community, we're mentor texts for each other. We're modeling, empathy and sustainability with each other. So I think that creating a space where students are trusted and have the space to dictate what we're doing and how we're doing it models a more healthy community. I don't think it's enough to say these should be our values. I think that needs to be embodied, and that needs to be practiced by everybody. And oftentimes teachers are the last people to practice the very norms that they want to seek in their classroom. They want people to listen, but maybe teachers aren't always the best listeners, or they want everyone to have a voice, but maybe sometimes only the teacher has the voice. So, and I'm guilty of all these things too. So I don't say this from a moral high ground. I say this as someone who's done this, time and time again.
And what would you say are the essential rules in that case when you start dealing with all this? What would be the a top 10, top 5 of the essential rules?
I think it's we created a procedure or a protocol, and if you follow the procedure, that is that was our rule in a sense. So at any point someone could raise their hand and say safety protocol or pause, and another part of the protocol was there aren't questions asked. We're not asking why might you feel triggered by this conversation, why are you uncomfortable, because that's not a comfortable position to put students in either, because they don't need to share their histories with the class if they're uncomfortable. So just creating a protocol that kind of again embodies the empathy that we seek to perpetuate in the classroom. So yeah, I think less about norms and rules, because I think those are kind of vague, and that's more like a norm is like the end result, but a protocol are the steps that you take to get there. So I think of it more as like, how do we create protocols that make sure that everybody's voice and choice is heard? And then, of course, revisiting those protocols and asking, do we need to modify them? Do they need to be changed? Is this working, or is it not working? And that's okay if it's not. I think a lot of times dissonance and frustration happens in a community when people, when the protocols aren't negotiated, in a way that's democratic among all the stakeholders in the room. So.
Oh, definitely. How can we get started planning student-centered lessons? Because we talk about a lot about student-centered lessons, but what would be like step 1? How can we get started with that?
I think if you maximize choice. So when we were talking about the text menus, where kids curate lots of text that they want to read, and then we collaboratively decide what we want to read. I think having a lot of different choice in the way you write. So if you're writing narrative, having choice across the modalities. Last year, I see my co-teacher, shout out to Grace Morvakai in the chat. So she and I taught together for 5, really 6 years, and we tried to give students a lot of different modalities. So recently we gave kids a choice to do a text message conversation, write graphic novels, create podcasts. One kid created a short film. They could do traditional kind of pen and paper stories if they wanted to. But so the content you're reading, the modalities you use when you write, but then also the creative creative liberties and the processes through which you write. So that's why I like the restoring framework, because it gives 6 different ways you can remix or restory a text in a way that centers your identity. So I think you can have a a foundational kind of trajectory or lesson plan, but then build in a lot of space for choice. And typically when we talk about differentiation, we talk about content, process, and product. So the content that you're analyzing or reading in the classroom, the process through which you do it, and then the product, what are students creating. And my co-teacher and I, we always tried our best to write and read alongside students. So trying not to have it be this hierarchical, like you do this, you do, but modeling our own writing and bringing our writing into the conversation. If we talk about feedback, if we talk about revision, we allow feedback and revision on our own writing from the students. And we're being mentored by the students in the same ways that we seek to try and mentor students, and to have students mentor each other. So writing alongside students is always very important too. And this isn't, my personal pedagogy or philosophy. This is the National Writing Project in the United States does this. The Writers' Workshop model really emphasizes this. So these aren't necessarily new pedagogies, but just ways that myself and my co-teacher and our students have done this together. Yeah.
Great. And what can you tell us to help students build identity online now that we are all only online?
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess when we think about online, I'm wondering if we're thinking about online in the sense of like, very public.
Lockdown.
Right now we're online and it's kind of very public, or online being within kind of the more, confined or private spaces of a Zoom chat, so, in the LARPing community, they're doing a lot of identity work online, but it's within the predetermined space of the community. Some scholarship talks about safe space, and a lot of, critical race theorists and critical educators will actually argue there's no such thing as a safe space, as long as we live in a world that continues to perpetuate injustice. And when we say this is a safe space, we might actually be, we might not be, it might not be entirely truthful, because, society isn't a safe space, and our classrooms are reflections always already of society. So, when I think about identity work online, I want to think about not how can that be done safely, because I think the idea of safety is always precarious, but how can that be done as safely as possible? And so while I do agree that we need to write for authentic audiences, we need to write beyond the classroom, I also understand that trolling and online bullying is a reality. And we also simultaneously want to, account for that when we think about how students negotiate their identities online. So I don't know if I have the best answer. I know how I would I know how I try to facilitate that within the, the limitations of a Zoom classroom. But like, as far as like Facebook posts, Instagram posts, tweeting, I think there are risks involved, and I'm hesitant to paint this rosy picture of people sharing their stuff online without acknowledging the the precarities and the dangers of that. So I think it's a good question because it's a difficult question. Yeah.
Speaking of difficult questions, what would you recommend for very young children literacy? I'm thinking about especially kindergarten or bilingual schools that can use English because through songs or stuff like that. And how can we introduce them to writing or reading or speaking or listening? But very young children, that's always hard for us to imagine.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wonder if now this is not. I will be transparent. This is not my expertise. I do mostly secondary, like middle and high school literacies, and then only more recently higher ed, undergraduate and graduate literacies. So I would be lying if I didn't to suggest that this is my specialty. But the first thing that comes to mind is when I think about scaffolding and I think about language, I think about the affordances and the benefits of visual language and like we use a lot of graphic novels and comic books in our classroom, and we have students where reading levels can be a little arbitrary and problematic, but at least formally from the measurements, we had students with reading levels from second grade up to 8th or 9th grade in a classroom, and we had to account for that and differentiate for that. And one thing that we tried to do was we tried to have single texts at different levels, and we would very oftentimes try and find graphic adaptations of stories. Another thing I'm thinking of is like in an elementary setting, like kindergarten, first grade, second grade, having stories that are mostly pictorial, maybe sometimes even entirely pictorial, and the assignment would not be to decode the language, but to decode the story visually, and maybe initially, if we're whatever language we're learning, try and use that language as we speak across the text and try and make sense of the text verbally first, and then maybe even subsequently practicing writing in text for the story. So trying to integrate scaffolds that bring students into it, and again allow for multiple literacies. I think this goes back to why it's important to expand the definition of literacy to literacies kind of more broadly, and to think more broadly about what a text can be, right? Because a text can also be a video. A text could be a gesture, anything can be interpreted, analyzed,
Definitely. Okay. Thank you so much for your time. I think I've asked all the questions. I don't know if there's anything else you would like to share with us. Teachers of English as a foreign language in a country with very few resources, and especially monolingual classes. Our students speak our language, so it's very hard for us to teach them reading, writing, or whatever in English because it's not necessary.
Yeah.
So these ideas are always helpful for us. We find it very hard to not speak Spanish in the class and deal with the language as a kind of object, like grammar or something away from us. So I would love to have access to those stories that your students write. Let me know when you have them published.
I'll share some resources over email if that helps to share out with your community for sure, and your students. And yeah,
I would love to read Harry Potter in the Bronx.
Resources that you guys have, I would love to. Yeah.
That'd be great. Okay, thank you so much for this. Okay,
thank you so much, and thank you for everyone who wrote comments. And it was really I hate doing most of the talking, but it was interesting to see everybody's comments and to hear everybody's questions and to think with you. So thank you for that. This was a blast.
Okay, see you soon.
Bye.